Hey, and welcome to, hold on, let me fix this. That probably looks about better, I think. We're gonna hope. Alright. Anyways, that's crooked. Alright. Hey, what is up? And welcome to Where All the Ladies At. This is a podcast where I dive deep into history, myth, and try to figure out where the fuck the women went, because there is not a lot of us in the history books. And I'm sure we did more cool things than just, say let them eat cake and shit like that. Anyways, welcome. I am Kim. I am your host. I am hold on, let me fix this. Okay. I am a history nerd, a myth lover, and an archaeology groupie, and I am also a writer. So, yes, and a cat lover. My kitty cat just decided to come join me. Hi, beautiful. Oh, thank you. Anyways, alright, and it is June, and that means it is Pride Month. I think I might be crooked. There we go. Alright, there we go. Definitely not straight. Hey, boom. I don't know. It happened, and I'm not taking it out. Anyways, it is Pride Month, and so for Pride Month, I want to celebrate it, and the way I'm choosing to celebrate it is by highlighting for myth, rainbow goddesses, and for history, we're going to take a look at some very key, iconic people that just happen to be gay. Yeah? So, a couple people we're going to talk about, you're probably going to know the names, and I'm going to use air quotes allegedly on a couple of them, or one of them in particular. The others, all pretty out and proud. One, not so much, but enough facts and things have been said to lump this lovely lady into it. So people we're going to cover is going to be Audre Lorde. We're going to cover Billie Holiday, Frida Kahlo, and Barbara Gittings. Those are the four that I chose to celebrate for Pride Month. Before we jump into that and talking about what Pride Month is, and also talking about the person in particular, there's some things I want to chat about. Starting next month, as I've said in all my myth videos, I am going to be going from 8 videos to 2 podcasts a month. So you will get 1 myth and 1 history. This is so it frees up time for me to build my business and also give you guys more content in other areas like social media, the Medium publication, and also start releasing a newsletter that will be available at first through my Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon, and then through my website when it gets up and running. Also coming up are going to be some ebooks that are going to be available on Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon, as well as my website, and maybe even Barnes & Noble Press, the website, the bookseller. The first book is done. I'm just editing, and so it's going to be Elizabeth Bathory, which is a very cool lady. Then going forward, we'll do some on historical figures as well as mythologies. Not sure how the mythology one's going to play out, but we'll figure it out as we go. So that's kind of why I'm pulling back a little on the podcast, to be able to give you guys more content in other places and hopefully build a community where we can really all get together and celebrate these ladies and all that kind of good stuff. That being said, if you do want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me via my social media. I have Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, but like I said, they've been a little dormant, but that will be changing. If you don't have social media, I also have an email you can reach out to me at. That's perfectly acceptable, or you can just leave a comment in the video or on the podcast, and I'll get back to you that way as well. Let's see. If you would like to support the podcast, like, comment, share, follow, subscribe, do all those kind of good things. The more you interact with the audio or the video, the more the algorithm thinks that I'm interesting and pushes me out to more people, and that is the way we're going to build this community. If you would like to kick some cash my way, currently it's just going to be donations, but like I said, in the next couple weeks you should have a book up there that you could purchase, and that will help you out. I was also thinking about doing some merchandise and things like that. That may come in the future as well. That might be a way as well to help me out. And then if you want information on this and so much more, you can check out the Medium publication, which will start being more active. And if you are into magical, mystical, spiritual things, you may want to check out my other podcast. It's called Our Mystic Road Trip. and it's kind of fun. So if that's something you're into, check it out. I think that's it for the shameless plugging and housekeeping. Now we can dive into Audre Lorde. Harlem's daughter and the pulse of a nation at a time. Audre Lorde is a black lesbian feminist, poet, warrior, and her voice really resonated from the heart of Harlem into every corner of the globe. We're going to look at her youth, we're going to look at her story and everything, but before we do, I want to talk about what Pride Month is and why it's important, and then we'll jump into her because she is important in this whole process. So, here's the thing. June is Pride Month, right? It's really a celebration of remembrance of like the LGBTQIA communities and allies, right? It honors victims' rights and recognition, the struggles that were endured, and the continuing fight for authenticity and freedom, okay? It's very important to me. I was always an ally. I always supported them, and I've said this in multiple videos, and then I realized I did a lot of deep soul work, and then some things happened, and I realized, you know what, I'm not only just an ally, I'm a part of the community. And it came very late in my life, and so it's a very important celebration. And it always has been, but it rings even more so now that I am part of the community. That being said, I will say, if you're someone who doesn't support LGBT, trans rights, women's rights, gay rights, rights, people of color and them having equal rights, those are all human rights. Human rights, because everybody is a human. And so if you're someone who doesn't believe that, it may be really hard for you to handle my stuff, because I did for a long time try to remain non-political, but in the climate that we're in and with the things that are happening in not just the country I'm from, which is the United States, but across the globe, I think those of us that have a voice, that are confident enough to step forward and say something, and there's a lot of ways to do that. It doesn't have to be vocally. It could be any way. But I think those of us that have that urge and that inkling and that ability, I think we really need to step up and say things. So unfortunately, I will talk about these things. So if it's something that you're not interested in, you don't believe that people should be able to love who they love, that they should be able to be who they are despite what we see them as, or despite what you see them as, then this may not be a great place for you. Just as a heads up, I am a feminist. I am someone who believes people should be able to marry and love who they want to love. I am someone who believes that everybody should have the same opportunities, despite their race, color, sexual orientation, any of that, and that. I think we as need to support people. So that being said, let's talk about Pride Month. Pride Month comes from the one big. Here's the thing: in 1969, Stonewall Inn, New York City. If you know, you know, right? This thing most everybody should know. There was a riot there, and this was because at the time it was illegal to be gay, right? So, there were police raids on queer clubs, and oftentimes they got very brutal. And this last time, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back, and some amazingly courageous black and brown women, black and brown women stood up and said, like, I'm tired of this, right? And that was Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Now, I will say, you probably noticed I didn't say transgender women, because a transgender woman is a woman. So these were women who stood up and said, I have had enough. And that event in and of itself ignited what came to be the modern LGBTQIA plus rights movement, right? And then this also sparked Pride Month. You know, it was an annual commemoration and activism, right? And when you think of Pride, you probably think of rainbow, right? You have the rainbow flag, and that's a big symbol for the community. And it came about 9 years later in 1978. It was created by Gilbert Baker, and it was really intended to show the diversity of the queer community and experiences, right? So, you know, colors, red equaled life, orange was healing, yellow was sunlight, green was nature, blue was harmony, and purple was spirit, right? And then as the years progressed, other things were added, like the inclusion of black and brown stripes. This really represents the people of color. And then the pink, blue, white for transgender communities. And this is kind of a symbol that really transcends all this stuff. It's really a symbol of unity and pride. And if you go back and you listen to my episodes, because I'm running late, guys, so I'm releasing a bunch of episodes all at once. So if you go check out my mythology episodes, you'll see that a lot of the mythology that comes from rainbows is just that. It is about transformation. It is about unity. It is about all of that. So I think it's a really beautiful representation. Now, it's important to celebrate this diversity, because pride is not just a symbol, right? It is a way that we affirm that everyone has the right to express who they are, whether that be sexuality or gender. And this is kind of where sociology and philosophy kind of meet together, right? It's an interesting. And I bring this up because I'm going to talk about Simone de Beauvoir and the gender as a construct idea. So if you are interested in that, make sure you go back and check out my episode. I did one on Simone de Beauvoir. She's an amazing philosopher, right? But the one quote that comes from her that is the most famous is, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," right? Gender is not innate or biological, right? It is more a set of roles, behaviors, and expectations that are put on us by culture and society, right? There is biological sex, that is true, but you have to untangle gender from it, because once you can do that, you open the door to understanding a lot of different people, whether that be non-binary or other more fluid identities, right? I think the big thing a lot of people don't understand is there's a difference between sexuality and gender, right? And there's a difference between sexuality and biological sex, okay? So biological sex is, yeah, right? Male, female, intersex, because we cannot forget them. But sexuality is who you're attracted to, whether that be emotionally, romantic, physically, whatever it is, right? Gender is the internal sense of self and how you express your identity to the world. These are related, yes, but very distinct parts of our identities, and each one deserves its own respect and recognition. I think, the question comes from a lot of people, why do we need to celebrate diversity? Why do we need labels? Look, if we could live in a world where nobody had to label themselves anything, that would be amazing. But that is not the world we live in. So labels are whatever you want. If you need them, use them. If they help you find your tribe and help you feel more in tune with who you are, I don't care, right? But we have to celebrate diversity. It is about affirmation. It's not just tolerance. It is saying, you know what? I celebrate you. I don't just accept you, I celebrate you. I see you. You are valid. That is such a big statement, right? Whether that's affirming diversity, sexuality, gender, race, any aspect of identity. When we can do that, it makes the whole community, the whole society stronger and brighter. Humanity is not just binary. It is a full spectrum. And when we can identify that That helps us enrich culture and creativity and connection. And that's what Pride's about. That's what celebration diversity is about, right? And until the world can see that, it's going to be hard for us to have a peaceful, harmonious world. And that's why I want to celebrate Pride. That's why I want to share the stories of these women and these goddesses. And I want to share the thought behind them, is because I think it's important. I think, I have this platform, and I may not have a huge audience yet, but I still want to use my voice, and that's what I'm doing. And that's Pride. And that's why I'm doing this month long. I know I'm late, but it's going to be 2-week long Pride, where I talk about these people. And that's why I chose the people I did, right? So let's get talking about that. Let's talk about Audre Lorde. So the first thing we're going to do, as always, we're going to look about where Audre Lorde grew up, and when she grew up, and how it was like for women, especially Black women, queer women, right? Because, once again, our environment and our surroundings do have an effect on us. So, to understand her and the struggles she had and how she overcame them, you have to look at where she came from and the environment she was raised in, right? So, Harlem, right? She was, Harlem, 1930s, right? Let's talk about it. Okay? So, in the 1920s, you had the Harlem Renaissance, right? This really laid a huge foundation for a lot of different things. It was a huge cultural explosion of Black poets and jazz musicians and artists and activists. It was this amazing time period where, the Black people in the U.S., African Americans, people of color, we'll say people of color, were really starting to have their voices heard. Granted, not in enough of a way that it changed a lot, but there was cracks starting to happen, right? Harlem became this national and international hub for Black culture and creativity, right? So it was just sparking. And then the 1930s hit. And the 1930s brought with it the Great Depression, right? Has severe economic hardship. Unemployment rates in Harlem really were twice the rest of that of New York City, right? Life expectancy in Harlem was very low compared to the city average, and this was really showing that there was a lot of harsh conditions living in this, right? But despite this, or in spite of this, the cultural spirit of this community endured. It was not erased by any economic struggles. It was a tight-knit neighborhood where hardship really became creative fuel, right? There were block parties and rent parties were common. And these were informal gatherings that raised money for rent while keeping the music, the culture alive, right? Gospel choirs provided spiritual hope beyond the financial means, right? You had the Harlem YWCA, and that was a sanctuary and empowering center for young Black women. And this offered vocational training and safe spaces, and a lot of places didn't offer that to women of color or people of color at that time, right? And as we move out of the 1930s, we get in the 1940s and 1950s, and even though there was segregation and poverty, Harlem's culture and activist energy still kept growing, right? There were everyday social spots, barbershops, and beauty salons, and these doubled as really places that organized hubs for civil rights and community activism, right? Jazz and poetry kind of combined together with protest and political consciousness, and this maintained this really vibrant pulse in Harlem. Harlem is one of the hubs for everything that occurs going forward from the 1940s and 50s, right? If we look at how it was for women, though, here, it was going to be a struggle, right? It was just general. But in Harlem, women were kind of a backbone of both the household and, in a sense, the broader community, right? They really had bad, because not only did they have systemic racism, but they had systemic sexism, which was even cooler, right? Let's double the dose, right? They had to work twice as hard and get far less recognition or pay, right? A lot of women at this time really worked in places like domestic workers, cooks, laundresses, and this typically meant for wealthier white families. These were jobs that really were hard jobs. They required long hours and did not get paid very much. Some worked in factories as well, and this was very physically demanding work. Things like sewing clothes and packing boxes, right? And the conditions were not great. But even despite all this grueling labor, right, they managed to make it work, and they balanced survival with dignity. I think when we look at these women, they just didn't endure hardship, right? They really, they conquered it. They moved through it. They nurtured joy and creativity even in these situations, right? Harlem's kitchens and living rooms and churches were really these hubs of cultural exchange and intellectual growth, and they were support networks were kind of built through these places as well. So building safe spaces so that the people of color and the people that lived in Harlem could share their struggles and their hopes and try to create plans to make their lives better, right? Women were not passive bystanders. They were actually really active in Harlem's history. They raised children who later then challenged those social, those things, racial and gender oppression. They supported Harlem's artists and writers and musicians and activists, and they really tried to amplify these voices so that they could reach beyond their community. I think the interesting thing for me, and the thing that was really awesome, is that there was like personal and political resilience, and it was almost like every act of survival was also an act of resistance. And I think that in and of itself is amazing, right? I think that is the perfect segue into talking about Audre Lorde. It kind of showed out that it kind of shows the world that she was growing in, and which really formed her, right? So here's the thing. We're going to start early life, right? So she was born in 1934. Both of her parents were immigrants from the Caribbean, and they moved into Harlem. And this was a neighborhood that was really rich with culture and contradictions, right? You had jazz and music flowing from basement clubs. It was a hub of activism and cultural ferment, and young Audre kind of absorbed this really vibrant mix, and that really shaped her worldview on a lot of things, right? In high school, she published her first poem, and that was in 17 magazine. And this really showed that she was on track, right? She was definitely determined. She had a talent, right? And the thing, though, is with her, poetry is beautiful, but sometimes poetry is just art, right? I mean, you can always read into things, and there's always that level of, like, literary dissection, right? But in truth, poetry sometimes is just poetry. But with her, it wasn't always just about art. Really, her poetry was kind of this weapon that she had to challenge racism and sexism and homophobia, right? This was her path. Because she identified as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet, and she proudly embodied all of those in her identity. She really decided to reject societal pressure to choose one identity or another. And I think that's one of the biggest things, right? So I think everybody deals with this, but I think women and sometimes is focused a little bit harder, and specifically women of color for sure. But we're told we have to be one thing, and we can't be complex. We can't be, you're a mother or you're a wife, or like, and it's like one thing, and it's almost unattractive or deemed unattractive if we're complex. And that's not how she viewed anything at all, right? She did all these things simultaneously and unapologetically, and that was a pretty radical stance in a world where, at the time, and honestly, in the world we're in today, sometimes it still demands it. It's less so, but it's still there. Really demands a woman compartmentalize her life, right? When we look at her work, you know, she really explored love between women and the silencing of queer voices, and really emphasized transformative power of living authentically and embracing complexity. And I think, you know, that is a beautiful sentiment. You know, from a very young age, she was already cultivating a voice that really refused to be erased or be told to be quiet or just like ignored. That wasn't happening with Audre. Like, it just wasn't, you know. As we moved in the 1970s and 80s, feminism and activism was always something on her thing. But I think the interesting with her is that there was a huge feminist movement at that time, but she really called them out. And she said, hey, you sideline women of color and you sideline lesbians, and that's not right. We're women too. We should be all together, right? And she really wanted intersectionality, and she did this way before it became trendy, before that word became trendy, right? She argued that true liberation must include everyone, and that includes queer people, and in particular, queer people of color, right? Anything less than that was not going to be true freedom. It was going to be half measured. It was going to be half-assed freedom. That's what it would have been, right? So I think that's something really important. I think when we look at her literary contributions, we have to look at I always have to read this because it's such a hard word. Biomythography, right? And so this is something that she really pioneered. She pioneered this. She blended autobiography with myth and legend, right? So for instance, in her work, it was called Zami, A New Spelling of My Name. And that's her landmark work. It's kind of the one that she's most known for, right? And this piece of work was really this fearless portrayal of her relationship with women and spiritual self-discovery, right? It showed the survival of that survival for Black lesbian women could also mean rewriting the narrative of what thriving looks like, right? So she wanted to rewrite that narrative. She wanted to show that, you know, thriving is different than just surviving, right? There is a distinct difference. And she did so by creating this biomythography, you know, and really it's this like revolutionary genre that is like meant to rewrite history, but through a personal lens. And I think that that is absolutely amazing. So we're going to step back for a second. We're going to talk about the 60s, because this was also a big time for civil rights, right? So in the 1960s, there was a lot of turmoil, right? You had civil rights marches, Malcolm X's powerful speeches, and here the reason I focus on Malcolm X is because Harlem was a frontline for activism and change, and he was a big part of that, right? Harlem has never just been a backdrop. It has, from the 1920s on, been this vibrant hub for political and cultural revolution, right? So in the 60s, Audre kind of took an active role. She was more than just a poet, right? She was outspoken. She was a feminist, and she was an activist, right? She made sure the movement spotlight didn't ignore Black women and queer voices. And I think that was important, right? You know, her activism really bridged civil rights and feminist and queer struggles and kind of tied them all together, right? One of the things that she did at this time was she founded Kitchen Table, which was a woman of color press. And she helped found this. She didn't do it all herself. This was the first U.S. publishing house run entirely by women of color. And it was really created to really amplify marginalized voices, specifically those that were like too often excluded from mainstream publishing. She really challenged racism within the LGBTQIA plus spaces, as well as homophobia within the Black and feminist communities. So because she straddled both, she used this this placement of hers to kind of identify overlaps, right? People aren't just Black and they aren't just queer or just women. They're not in isolation, right? you know, they're all together. She kind of believed that liberation needed to be holistic, right? No identity should be left behind in the fight for injustice. She was really, if you look at her and you read her poetry and you hear anything about her, she was kind of like this true embodiment of the Harlem spirit, right? She was not only just chronicling life, but she was chronicling Harlem. She was talking about how Harlem, she was living in Harlem. You know, it was a living, breathing essence to her. Her presence really represented music and resistance and joy and sorrow of the community. She gave this voice to those silenced and marginalized people, and that's what made her work so communal and personal, right? If we keep going and we talk about inspirations of poetry and poetry, right, we have to talk about her writing style. I'm geeking out because I'm a writer, right? And I'm just, when I do writers, I feel like we got to talk about her style, right? So when we talk about her style, we have to use the words like raw, unflinching, direct, right? This was, it was very much like a Harlem street preacher, right? Her poetry was not just written for reading, but to be spoken aloud, right? She really turned those verses into protests and helped build the community, right? Like I said, she really tried to blend some autobiographies with like cultural critiques. So her work was very personal and political all at the same time. If you read her stuff, you will see like her stuff is really short and punchy lines with a lot of very central imagery, and that made her, because it was short and punchy lines, it made her poetry like accessible, but also very haunting, right? As I said, she described herself as a certain way, right? She was a black lesbian mother, warrior poet, and every aspect of that fueled that writing, right? Her writing had this fire and showed that fire from multiple identities, and the fact that fire was all woven really tightly together, right? Inspiration wise, you have to think like the jazz and the street politics and the black survival and the joy shaped her worldview and voice, right? That came from Harlem. On top of that, you have to also look at her Grenadian heritage, which is her Caribbean group, connected her to the global black diaspora. I can always say that wrong, and history. So that is the people of color or black people that left their home and built their community someplace else, right? She also had very big feminist foremothers to inspire her. People like June Jordan and Pat Parker, and the Black Arts Movement demanded a lot more politically charged art. You know, her personal life, you know, she had some severe battles with breast cancer and motherhood and queerness and activism, and all of this informed her poetry and made it much more deep and much more honest. Let's go. So she famously said, "Poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence." And as someone who writes poetry and someone who is a writer, I would agree that, right? Poetry can be a sword and it can be a shield. It is a survival tool that could help, you know, fight against a world that was trying to silence her. And I think if you are a writer, you can think that to you too. Like you can use these things as a sword and a shield to help, so that your voice isn't silenced either. You know, the power of Lorde's poetry, I want to, you know, here's the thing. We can't talk about her poetry without letting her own words speak for themselves, right? It's really like you're standing in front of a mirror and you're trying to, you know, it's not going to lie to you, right? So I'm just going to read a snippet of one of her poems. I'll try to do it justice. Hopefully I will. And this is from A Litany of Survival. This was released in 1978. And this is really a poem that kind of is meant to remind us that silence is not really a sanctuary. So I'm going to try to do this justice. I hope I do. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edge of decision and crucial and alone, for those of us who cannot indulge the passion's dream of choice, who love in doorways coming and going in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. You can hear the heartbeat behind those words. You can, she's really crying out to every soul who's ever just felt pushed to the edge, right? And another one I want to do is Who Said It Was Simple? That's 1973. And this really shows that she never really shied away from that intersection of race, gender, and power. There are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. That's a simple image, like, right? And it's an image that, if when you think about it, you know, it's just like a gut punch. It's like boom, right? I think that's where I'm gonna leave it. I think with a few of her words is pretty awesome. You know, I think as we reflect on her, we have to be reminded that words have power. They can challenge, they can heal, they can transform. They can be used as weapons, or they can be used as bridges. That is the truth. And hopefully the world begins using those bridges much more than the swords that they're being used as now. You know, she traveled from Harlem's vibrant streets to become a global name and really teach us about the enduring strength of human spirit. So that is Audre Lorde. That is my first historical person for Pride Month. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you go out and read more of her poetry, read more about her, learn more about her. She's an amazing woman. And as always, if you want to reach out to me, you have any comments or anything, please, you can use social media. If you want to support the podcast, like, comment, share, follow, subscribe, of course. You can also visit my Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon. If you want to learn more about her and so much more, check out my Medium publication. And if you're into mystical, magical, spiritual stuff, make sure you check out my other podcast, Our Mystic Road Trip. Thank you for joining me on this very poignant exploration of Audre Lorde. I hope you enjoyed. As always, until next time, guys, stay curious, stay safe, and stay blessed.